March 6, 1944. 26,000 feet over the smoking outskirts of Berlin. Inside the unpressurized tail of the B-17 Hell's Fury, the ambient temperature is 60 below zero, but Staff Sergeant Mike Donovan is sweating. 6 Focke-Wulf 190 seconds have just slotted into his dead 6, directly behind, level, and steady. They aren't flashing past at a blur. Because the fighters are chasing the bomber, the relative closing speed drops to a crawling 100 knots. To a physicist, this is a zero deflection solution. To Donovan, it's a firing squad. The Germans are armed with 20mm Mauser cannons that outrange his twin, 50 calibers, by nearly a quarter mile. He is trapped in a mathematical coffin, staring down the barrel of a weapon that can kill him long before he is allowed to pull the trigger. To understand how he survived the next 4 minutes, we have to understand why the Army told him to wait. The doctrine that sent Mike Donovan up that day was written in 1942 in the safe, air-conditioned classrooms of the Las Vegas Army Gunnery School. It was a doctrine built on the scarcity of logistics, not the reality of ballistics. Every cadet, including Donovan, stared at the same blackboard diagram, a B-17 surrounded by a sphere of defense. The rule was absolute: conserve your ammunition. Do not fire until the enemy enters the effective zone, defined precisely as 600 yards. Inside this imaginary bubble, the 50 caliber Browning machine gun was king. Outside of it, you were just shouting at the wind. The logic was brutally simple. A standard B-17 tail gunner position held 565 rounds per gun. The M2 Browning fires at a rate of 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. If you hold the trigger down, your war is over in 42 seconds. If you panic, if you spray at shadows, you will be clicking on empty chambers when the real attack comes. So, the instructors drilled discipline into them. Short, controlled bursts. Wait for the whites of their eyes. Wait until you can't miss. But the instructors in Las Vegas hadn't accounted for the Luftwaffe's rapid evolution. By 1944, the Germans had stopped playing by American rules. They had analyzed the B-17's defensive geometry and found the flaw in the math. They realized that if they attacked from the rear, matching the bomber's speed, the closing velocity dropped to almost nothing. It wasn't a high-speed joust. It was a slow-motion execution. More importantly, they brought a new weapon to the fight, the MG 151/20 Mauser cannon. This wasn't just a machine gun. It was an autocannon firing Minengeschoss high-capacity mine shells. Thin-walled and packed with high explosives, a single 20mm round could blow a hole in a wing the size of a watermelon. But the terrifying statistic wasn't the damage, it was the range. The Mauser was accurate and lethal at 1,000 yards. Donovan, sitting in the mess hall with a physics textbook he'd stolen from the base library, saw the discrepancy immediately. It was a ballistic gap. If the German fighter sits at 900 yards, he is perfectly safe. The American, 50 caliber bullets, lighter and losing energy fast, will drop off or disperse harmlessly before reaching him. But from that same 900-yard perch, the German pilot can lob 20mm explosive shells directly into the bomber's tail. The doctrine of wait until 600 yards demanded that American gunners sit passively while flying through 300 yards of unchallenged enemy fire. They were being ordered to stand in a firing squad and wait for the executioners to reload before fighting back. When Donovan raised this point during a briefing, the response was bureaucratic ice. "You are not paid to do the math, Sergeant. You are paid to follow the firing tables." The system was terrified of runaways gunners who panicked and burned their barrels out in the first 10 minutes of an 8-hour mission. To the brass, a gunner out of ammo was a liability. To Donovan, a gunner dead from a 20mm shell was a statistic. The tension between the paper pushers and the dog faces came to a head over the hardware itself. For the first half of the war, tail gunners were crammed into the Stinger mount, a claustrophobic manual setup where the gunner had to physically muscle the heavy twin guns against the slipstream. Tracking a fighter required the strength of a linebacker and the finesse of a surgeon. It was exhausting, and it encouraged passivity. But in early 1944, a new piece of technology arrived at the 390th Bombardment Group that would change the equation: the Cheyenne Tail Turret. This was a radical redesign. It shortened the tail, widened the field of view, and most importantly, added a powered hydraulic traverse and a reflector sight. Suddenly, the guns didn't fight the gunner. They moved with the touch of a fingertip. The optical sight, a glowing orange reticle projected onto glass, allowed for something the old iron sights made difficult: precise deflection tracking. Donovan looked at the Cheyenne turret and saw what the instructors missed. They saw a tool for better accuracy within the 600-yard box. Donovan saw a tool for zone denial. He realized that the 2,000 rounds of ammunition weren't just for killing airplanes, they were for buying space. The lethal gap, that 300-yard suicide run where the Germans were safe, could be closed, not by hitting the enemy, but by terrifying him. The theory was sound, but the culture was rigid. On the tarmac, the crew chief, a veteran named Murphy, watched Donovan loading extra belts of ammunition, contrary to flight weight regulations. "You burn that barrel out, Mike, and I'll kill you myself," Murphy warned. "If you run dry over the target, don't expect the waist gunners to save your neck." The fear was real. AB-17 without a tail gunner is a shark without teeth. The pack will sense the weakness and tear it apart from behind. By proposing to fire early, to fire wastefully, Donovan wasn't just breaking protocol. He was risking the lives of all 10 men on board. He was gambling that psychology traveled faster than bullets. He believed that a German pilot, no matter how disciplined, was still human. And humans flinch when they fly into a wall of fire, even if the math says they are safe. As Hell's Fury formed up over the English Channel, climbing through the gray muck toward the freezing blue, the debate was theoretical. But as they crossed the coastline of Fortress Europe, the theory was about to be tested against the hardest reality of all. The radar-controlled flak bursts started as black smudges in the distance, and the radio crackled with the call that turned stomachs across the formation. "Bandits. 6 o'clock. Level." The doctrine said, "Wait." The survival instinct screamed fire, and Mike Donovan, staring into the reflector sight of his new turret, had to decide which voice to listen to. The German fighters were queuing up, confident in their range advantage, preparing to dissect the bomber from a distance. They knew the Americans wouldn't shoot yet. They knew the rules. They didn't know Donovan had rewritten them. He didn't rewrite them with bravado. He rewrote them with geometry. To the rest of the crew, Staff Sergeant Donovan was just another kid from Boston who liked his cigarettes unfiltered and his coffee black. But when he looked out the plexiglass of the tail, he didn't see the romantic blue yonder. He saw a three-dimensional grid of vectors, velocities, and intersecting parabolas. Donovan wasn't a brawler. He was a ballistics savant. While other gunners spent their leave drinking in London pubs, he was often found on the flight line, pacing off distances and sketching diagrams on the back of maintenance logs. He understood instinctively what the Army manuals failed to articulate. In aerial combat, the target isn't the airplane. The target is the empty space where the airplane is forced to fly. His epiphany coincided with the arrival of the B-17G model, specifically the retrofit that removed the claustrophobic Stinger tail and replaced it with the Cheyenne turret. This was the hardware that made the heresy possible. The old Stinger mount was a manual brute. The gunner knelt on pads, physically muscling the heavy twin. 50 seconds against the slipstream of a 200 mile-per-hour wind. Tracking a fighter maneuvering at high Gs was like trying to swing a sledgehammer underwater. But the Cheyenne was a powered hydraulic dream. It shortened the bomber's overall length by 5 inches, widened the field of fire, and utilized the K3 reflector sight. Gone were the primitive iron ring and bead sights that obstructed the view. The K3 projected a glowing orange reticle onto a clear plate of glass. It allowed Donovan to keep both eyes open, maintaining peripheral vision while tracking the bandit. But the real revolution wasn't just seeing the enemy, it was the speed of the traverse. With a slight twist of the hand grips, the hydraulic motors whined, swinging the turret faster than any human muscle could manage. Armed with this new agility, Donovan developed a theory that would have failed him out of gunnery school instantly: active zone denial. The standard operating procedure relied on the concept of point defense, aiming at a specific enemy aircraft to destroy it. This required the enemy to be close enough for a high-probability hit. Donovan realized that against the 20mm cannon, point defense was a losing strategy. You cannot win a sniper duel with a pistol. Instead, he proposed treating the sky like terrain. His theory was based on the cone of fire. A .50 caliber bullet doesn't fly straight. It creates a dispersion pattern. At 1,000 yards well beyond the effective range, the bullets from his twin guns would spread out, creating a lethal shotgun blast effect roughly 30 feet wide. He calculated that he didn't need to drill a hole in the pilot's forehead. He just needed to place a 30-foot wall of lead directly in the flight path of the interceptor. "It's not about killing them, sir," Donovan argued to the skepticism of Captain Reynolds, the squadron gunnery officer. "It's about making them blink. A German pilot is flying a precision machine. To line up his cannons, he needs stable air and a steady hand. If I throw 100 rounds of turbulence and tracers into his face at 1,000 yards, he has to react. He breaks his aim, he breaks his formation, and once he breaks, he's useless." Reynolds, a man whose career was built on the logistics of supply chains, looked at Donovan like he was speaking a foreign language. "Sergeant, you are talking about spraying precious ammunition into the stratosphere. The dispersion at that range is massive. You're firing at ghosts." "I'm firing at their future positions, sir," Donovan countered, his voice steady. "Physics says they have to fly through that box to get to us. If I fill that box with metal before they get there, they have two choices: fly into a meat grinder or peel off." The economic argument was the final nail in the coffin of the old doctrine. Donovan laid it out with cold precision. A single 50 caliber round cost the U.S. government roughly 18 cents. A burst of 50 rounds cost $9. A B-17 Flying Fortress cost $238,000 and carried 10 highly trained specialists. "I will trade $9 of lead for a $250,000 bomber every single time," Donovan said. "If I run dry, I run dry. But I won't die with a full belt." The officer dismissed him with a warning, marking the file with a note on wasteful tendencies. But Donovan wasn't looking for permission. He was looking for survival. He spent the nights before the Berlin mission modifying his feed chutes, ensuring the belts wouldn't snag during the rapid, high-angle traverses his new tactic required. He wasn't planning to snipe. He was planning to paint the sky. As the formation pushed deeper into Germany, the theory was just ink on paper. But at 26,000 feet, as the contrails of the Focke-Wulfs began to coalesce into attack vectors, the time for theory ended. The math savant of the 390th settled into his seat, switched on the K3 sight, and watched the glowing orange ring settle on the empty air, half a mile in front of the lead German fighter. He wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at the invisible point in space where the enemy was about to die. He took a breath, exhaled, and prepared to violate every order he'd ever been given. The lead fighter dipped its wing, committing to the attack run. The distance was 1,200 yards. Impossible range, suicide range. Donovan squeezed the triggers. The resulting vibration didn't just shake the airframe, it rattled the teeth of every man on board Hell's Fury. When a twin-mount M2 Browning unleashes a sustained barrage, it generates a recoil force of nearly 200 pounds, hammering against the airframe at 16 cycles per second. Up in the cockpit, nearly 70 feet away, Captain James Whitmore felt the shudder travel through the aluminum stringers and into the control yoke. It felt like the bomber was tearing itself apart. "Donovan, cease fire. You're shooting at ghosts." Whitmore's voice crackled over the intercom, distorted by the static of the throat microphone. "Save it for the merge." This was the voice of the system reacting exactly as it had been designed. To the pilot, Donovan's premature fire wasn't just a tactical error. It was a mechanical liability. The 8th Air Force had strictly codified the economy of force. Every pound of weight on a B-17 was calculated to the ounce. Fuel, bombs, men, and ammunition. The standard loadout of 565 rounds per tail gun was a calculated actuarial limit. It was enough for approximately 10 distinct 3-second engagements. By opening fire at 1,200 yards, Donovan was burning through that actuarial limit at a rate of 25 rounds per second. In the eyes of the establishment, he was effectively dumping fuel overboard before reaching the target. The rejection of Donovan's zone denial theory wasn't just about ammunition counts. It was rooted in the rigid understanding of dispersion physics. During his previous confrontation with Major Kincaid, the group gunnery officer, the math had been used as a bludgeon against him. Kincaid had slapped a ballistics chart onto the desk, a chart governed by the laws of Gaussian distribution. "Look at this cone, Sergeant," Kincaid had barked, tracing the widening fan of fire. "The M2 machine gun is not a laser. It has mechanical vibration, barrel harmonics, and mounting flex. By the time your bullets travel 1,000 yards, the cone of fire is nearly 40 feet wide. You could fly a Piper Cub through the gaps in your pattern and never get scratched." To the Major, this dispersion was a flaw. It meant that at long range, the hit probability dropped to near zero. The Army demanded precision. They wanted steel on target. Firing when the hit probability was 1% was considered a dereliction of duty. It was, in the harsh language of the after-action reports, panic fire. But the rejection went deeper than math. It was about the limitations of the machine itself. The AN-M2 Browning air-cooled machine gun had a fatal thermal threshold. The friction of a copper-jacketed bullet traveling down a steel barrel at 2,900 feet per second generates immense heat. In short bursts, the slipstream of cold air at high altitude cools the barrel, but in a sustained zone denial barrage holding the trigger for 5, 6, or 7 seconds, the barrel temperature spikes critically. The rifling begins to soften. The metal expands. If Donovan held that trigger too long, he risked a cook-off. This happens when the chamber gets so hot that the propellant in the cartridge ignites spontaneously without the firing pin striking the primer. Once a gun starts cooking off, you can't stop it. It becomes a runaway chain reaction, firing until the belt is empty, or the barrel physically melts and droops like a wilting flower. "You'll melt your barrels before the Germans even get into range," Kincaid had warned. "And then you'll be sitting in the back of the bus with a 60-pound paperweight while a Focke-Wulf dissects you." Donovan knew the risks. He knew the friction coefficients. But he also knew something about the psychology of the man in the other cockpit. He knew that the German pilot didn't have a ballistics chart taped to his instrument panel. He wouldn't be calculating the Gaussian distribution of the incoming fire. He would see a stream of magnesium-tipped tracers rushing toward his canopy at twice the speed of sound, and his lizard brain would scream one word: collision. Back in the freezing tail of hell's fury, the belt feed motor whined in protest. The standard ammunition chutes were designed for gravity-assisted feeding during level flight. They weren't designed for the violent torque of the Cheyenne Turret swinging 45 degrees while spewing hot brass. Donovan had spent the night before the mission illegally modifying the feed chutes, using baling wire and lithium grease to reduce the friction, praying the belts wouldn't snag. A jam now would be a death sentence. The tracers arced out into the blue void, burning bright red against the cold sky. To Captain Whitmore in the cockpit, they looked like waste. To Major Kincaid back at base, they represented a violation of doctrine. But to Donovan, watching the tracers walk their way toward the approaching swarm, they were probing fingers, reaching out to touch the enemy's nerve. He wasn't trying to hit the plane. He was trying to hit the pilot's conviction. The lead German fighter, a veteran in a yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf, 190, ignored the first second of fire. He knew the range was too great. He held his course, his wings level, his cannons silent, closing the distance with the arrogance of a predator who knows the prey is toothless. He was 5 seconds away from his own firing solution. Donovan didn't let up. He adjusted his aim, not at the fighter, but slightly ahead of it, creating a turbulent wall of supersonic air and lead. He held the trigger past the 3-second safety limit. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. The gun trunnions hammered against their mounts. The smell of burning cordite filled the oxygen mask. The barrels began to glow a dull, angry red. The system had said it was impossible. The system said the gun would jam, the barrel would melt, and the bullets would miss. The system was about to blink. But the blink didn't happen in the eyes of the American gunner. It happened in the mind of the German pilot. At 26,000 feet, the air is thin, and light travels without distortion. The pilot of the lead Focke-Wulf, an Oberleutnant with 3 kills to his name, saw the muzzle flashes from Hell's Fury ignite like strobe lights. He was a disciplined hunter, trained to ignore defensive fire until the last possible second. He knew the physics of aerial combat as well as anyone. He knew that a .50 caliber bullet fired from 1,000 yards away would take nearly 1.5 seconds to reach him. In a dogfight, 1.5 seconds is an eternity. By the time those bullets arrived, he would be 300 yards closer, and the bullets would pass harmlessly through the empty air where his aircraft used to be. But Donovan wasn't playing by the rules of a sniper. He was playing by the rules of a trap shooter. To understand the genius of what happened next, we have to freeze time. We have to stop the spinning propellers and the roaring engines and look at the geometry of death frozen in the sub-zero air. If Donovan aims his sight directly at the yellow nose of the Focke-Wulf and pulls the trigger, he misses. It is a guaranteed miss every time. This is the pursuit curve fallacy. because the enemy fighter is moving at 350 miles per hour and the bullet is traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The two vectors are disconnected. If you shoot at the target, the bullet arrives at the point in space where the target was, not where it is. The bullet passes safely behind the tail. This is the paradox of deflection shooting. To kill the enemy, you must shoot at nothing. You must aim at a patch of empty blue sky, the lead point, and trust that the enemy will fly into it. But calculating that lead point involves a mental calculus that computers today struggle to perfect. The gunner must account for the time of flight, how long the bullet takes to get there, the target velocity, how fast the enemy is moving, and the most complex variable of all, the rad of turn. If the German pilot banks his wings to curve in for an attack, he is pulling G-forces. He is no longer flying in a straight line. He is flying along the arc of a circle. To hit him, Donovan has to shoot not just ahead of him, but inside his turn, aiming at a point where the fighter's future trajectory intersects with the bullet's dropping arc. Donovan didn't try to solve this equation with a calculator. He solved it with a fire hose. Instead of firing a short, precise burst at a calculated point, Donovan initiated the spray. He clamped his gloved hands onto the handles of the Cheyenne turret and swept the guns in a gentle, horizontal figure-8 pattern. He wasn't trying to thread a needle. He was painting a fence. He was creating a zone of probability. By oscillating the guns while pouring out 25 rounds per second, he created a dynamic, shifting wall of lead that covered the entire likely flight path of the interceptor. He was effectively denying the German pilot any safe airspace to fly through. The German Oberleutnant committed to his attack run. He pushed his stick forward, lining up his reflector sight on the bomber's tail. He was focused, tunnel-visioned on the kill. And then, the wall arrived. From the cockpit of the Focke-Wulf, it looked like the bomber was vomiting fire. The tracers weren't just whizzing past. They were drifting toward him in a lazy, hypnotic stream that suddenly snapped into high-speed focus as they crossed his nose. This is the optical illusion of relative motion. Tracers appear to float gently until the final moment when they flash past at supersonic speeds. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, the air around the Focke-Wulf was filled with armor-piercing incendiary, API rounds. Donovan's first stream of bullets missed the cockpit by 50 feet. But they didn't miss the mind. The German pilot saw the wall of red phosphorus burning toward him. He saw the sheer volume of fire, and in that split second, instinct overrode training. The human brain has a primitive collision avoidance system wired deep into the amygdala. When you see an object rushing toward your face, you flinch. The Oberleutnant flinched. He jerked the control stick hard to the right, breaking his smooth attack curve. It was a reflex, a desperate twitch to avoid the incoming fire. But at 350 miles per hour, a sudden jerk on the controls translates to a violent, high-G maneuver. The Focke-Wulf snapped onto its wingtip, exposing its entire underbelly to the bomber formation. By flinching, the German pilot had done two things. First, he had ruined his own aiming solution. His cannons were now pointing harmlessly at the clouds. Second, and more fatally, he had flown directly into the second wave of Donovan's spray. Donovan hadn't stopped firing. He had anticipated the break. He knew that when a pilot panics, he usually breaks down and away. So Donovan was already dragging his fire into the lower right quadrant. The physics of the collision were catastrophic. The Focke-Wulf, now presenting a massive target profile, flew straight into the stream of 50 caliber rounds. It wasn't a sniper shot, it was a collision. The bullet struck the fighter's wing root and engine, cowling with the force of sledgehammers. The thump-thump-thump of impacts was audible even over the roar of the BMW radial engine. An API round pierced the oil cooler. Another shattered the plexiglass of the canopy. The fighter didn't explode in a Hollywood fireball. Real air combat is rarely that clean. Instead, the Focke-Wulf began to bleed. Thick black oil sprayed across the windshield, blinding the pilot. Smoke trailed from the cowling. The engine sputtered, choked, and died. The threat didn't vaporize, it simply ceased to be a threat. The German fighter rolled inverted, trailing smoke, and fell away toward the earth, effectively erased from the battle. "Got him," the ball turret gunner yelled. "He's going down. He's smoking." But Donovan didn't cheer. He didn't even pause to watch the fighter fall. Because the zone denial theory wasn't about killing one man. It was about breaking the pack. The remaining 5 Focke-Wulfs in the formation had seen their leader fly into a buzzsaw. They saw the tracers reaching out to distances that shouldn't have been possible. They saw the density of the fire, and they hesitated. That hesitation, that split second of doubt, was the victory. The tight, disciplined Finger 4 formation loosened. The wingmen drifted apart, their confidence shaken. They were no longer a coordinated execution squad. They were 5 individuals wondering if the Americans had developed a new secret weapon. Donovan released the triggers. The barrels were smoking, glowing a dull cherry red in the shadows of the turret. The air inside the tail smelled of sulfur and sweat. He checked his ammunition belt. He had burned nearly 400 rounds in 8 seconds. A logistical disaster by Army standards. But behind him, the sky was empty. The emptiness of that sky was the only statistic that mattered. Standard Army doctrine measured success in hard kills, smoking wreckage on the ground, confirmed by gun camera footage or witness testimony. But Donovan had just achieved something far more valuable, something the manuals didn't have a name for yet: a psychological kill. The remaining 5 Focke-Wulfs didn't retreat because they were damaged. They retreated because the math in their heads had suddenly changed. To understand why seasoned Luftwaffe veterans would flee from a single bomber, you have to understand the terrifying optical illusion of the tracer round. In 1944, American ammunition belts were linked in a specific sequence: 4 armor-piercing incendiary, API, rounds followed by 1 M1 tracer. The tracer contained a hollow base packed with strontium nitrate and magnesium, which ignited upon firing to burn with a bright red glare for roughly 1,000 yards. This 1 in 5 ratio meant that for every red streak the German pilots saw, 4 invisible ghost bullets were traveling alongside it. When Donovan unleashed his spray, he wasn't just sending out a visual warning, he was creating a mental multiplier. To the German eye, that solid red hose of fire represented a density of metal that seemed physically impenetrable. It triggered a primal cognitive dissonance, the wall of fire effect. A pilot can be trained to fly through flak. He can be trained to ignore a single bandit on his tail. But the human brain struggles to override the survival instinct when facing a continuous, unbroken stream of fire that appears to be solid matter. Donovan's zone denial exploited this neurological weakness. By firing early and firing wide, he inflated the perceived threat. He made the B-17 look like a battleship. The 5 remaining fighters circled warily, probing for a new angle. They were looking for the lull the moment the gunner stopped to cool his barrels or conserve ammo. That was the standard rhythm of an interception. Burst, pause, burst, pause. The pause was the invitation to attack. But Donovan didn't pause. As the second element of fighters tried to line up a high-side attack from the 7 o'clock position, Donovan swung the Cheyenne Turret around and opened up again at 1,400 yards. The range was ludicrous. The bullets had lost half their kinetic energy. They probably wouldn't even penetrate the armored glass of the German windscreens. But the tracers were still burning bright red. The lead German in the second group saw the red arc reaching out for him way too early, way too aggressive. He didn't know the bullets were losing velocity. He just saw the reach of the enemy. He broke off immediately, diving away into the cloud deck. His wingman followed. They didn't even jettison their drop tanks. They just left. The risk-reward calculus had collapsed. Why die attacking a wild gunner when there were hundreds of other, more passive bombers in the stream? Hell's Fury flew on, unmolested. The silence in the interphone system was heavy. The crew was waiting for the reprimand. They were waiting for the captain to scream about the wasted ammunition. But Captain Whitmore said nothing. He was too busy watching the other bombers in the formation, the ones playing by the rules, getting chewed up by the fighters that had bypassed Donovan's sector. 6 hours later, the wheels of Hell's Fury screeched onto the tarmac at Framlingham. The B-17 taxied to its hard stand, engines coughing into silence. As the prop spun down, the ground crew swarmed the aircraft, ready to patch holes and count the dead. Sergeant Murphy, the crew chief, climbed into the tail section first. He popped the covers on the ammunition bins. They were empty, not low, bone dry. The metal links lay in a pile on the floor, a testament to a firing rate that should have melted the barrels. "Jesus, Mike," Murphy muttered, running a gloved hand over the cooling shrouds of the M2S. "You fired 2,000 rounds. You stripped the rifling right out of these guns." Then came the officer. Major Kincaid, the gunnery officer, arrived in a jeep. clipboard in hand, ready to file a disciplinary report for reckless expenditure of ordnance. He marched up to the tail, looking at the empty bins with the disgust of an accountant finding a discrepancy in the ledger. "Explain this, Sergeant," Kincaid barked, pointing at the empty chutes. The other crews came back with 40% of their load remaining. "You are completely dry. You left this aircraft defenseless for the last hour of the flight." Donovan climbed out of the hatch, pulling off his flight cap. He looked exhausted, his face stained with gun oil and sweat. He didn't snap to attention. He simply pointed a thumb at the fuselage of Hell's Fury. "Count the holes, sir," Donovan said. Kincaid paused. He looked up at the aluminum skin of the bomber. He walked around the stabilizer. He checked the waist. He checked the rudder. There were no holes. Other B-17 seconds had returned that day, looking like sieves' rudders shredded, plexiglass shattered, blood on the floorboards. They had followed the doctrine. They had conserved their ammo, and they had been butchered. Hell's Fury hadn't taken a single 20mm hit. "I fired 2,000 rounds to buy us 4 minutes of silence," Donovan said, lighting a cigarette. "Those rounds cost the taxpayer about $300. How much does a new B-17 cost, Major?" The vindication wasn't in the argument, it was in the artifact. The pristine bomber sitting on the runway was irrefutable proof. The waste had purchased survival. Word spread through the barracks that night. It wasn't an official change in policy. Generals don't admit mistakes that quickly. But among the enlisted men, the Donovan method became a whispered contagion. The tail gunners stopped hoarding their bullets like misers. They realized that ammunition was the only expendable resource on the plane. In the weeks that followed, the casualty rates for the 390th Bombardment Group began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic spike in German planes, shot down. The kill counts actually stayed relatively flat, but the abort rates skyrocketed. German fighter pilots, encountering this new wall of aggressive, long-range fire, began to break off their attacks earlier. They started engaging from extreme distances, spraying their own cannon fire inaccurately in a desperate attempt to suppress the tail gunners. The dynamic of the air war had inverted. The B-17, once a passive victim waiting to be culled, had become a prickly, dangerous porcupine. The gunners weren't shooting to kill anymore. They were shooting to dominate the airspace. They were trading lead for miles and noise for lives. But the Army Air Forces wasn't satisfied with just scaring the Luftwaffe. They wanted to destroy it. And while Donovan's tactics kept the bombers alive, a new technological marvel was arriving in England that would take the concept of aggression and turn it into extermination. Because while the B-17 seconds were learning to fight back, they were still prey. They needed a predator of their own. That predator wasn't just the P-51 Mustang arriving on the wing. It was the ghost arriving in the turret. While the Donovan doctrine of aggression changed the psychology of the fight, the Army Air Forces knew that aggression alone couldn't bend the laws of physics. To truly close the ballistic gap between the German cannon and the American machine gun, the gunners needed a partner that could think faster than a human. They needed a mechanical brain. Entering late 1944, the Cheyenne turrets began receiving an upgrade that looked like science fiction to the boys from the farm. The Sperry K4 computing gun sight. Before the K4, a gunner had to guess the deflection. He had to use Kentucky windage, estimating the speed and angle of the enemy fighter based on gut instinct and experience. But the K4 removed the guesswork. It contained a series of gyroscopes and analog computers. When the gunner tracked a target, he didn't just point the guns, he framed the enemy aircraft within a diamond of light on the glass. As he moved the turret to follow the fighter, the gyroscopes sensed the rate of turn. The computer calculated the lead angle, instantly factoring in air density, bullet drop, and target velocity, and physically moved the reticle away from the target. The gunner simply kept the enemy in the diamond, and the computer aimed the guns at the empty sky where the collision would occur. It was the grandfather of the modern aimbot. But technology is dead weight without the flesh and blood to wield it. The Mike Donovan of our story is a narrative vessel, a composite built to illustrate a tactical revolution. But the men he represents were not fiction. They were real, they were terrified, and they were lethally effective. If you want to see the true face of the zone denial artist, you have to look at the service record of Staff Sergeant Michael Arooth. A tail gunner with the 379th Bomb Group, Arooth didn't need a computer to understand aggression. On the 30th of July 1943, during a raid over Kassel, His B-17 was jumped by a swarm of fighters. Arooth didn't wait. He engaged early, breaking up the first wave. But the Germans were determined. A 20mm shell smashed into the tail, destroying his oxygen system and shattering the hydraulic lines. In the thin air at 25,000 feet, hypoxia sets in within minutes. Your vision tunnels. Your brain shuts down. Most men would have passed out and died. Arooth grabbed a portable oxygen bottle, disconnected his mask from the main line, and kept fighting. With the hydraulics dead, he had to muscle the twin guns by hand, cranking hundreds of pounds of steel against the slipstream. When his guns jammed, he stripped them down during the attack, cleared the feed, and resumed firing. By the time the aircraft landed, Arooth was credited with destroying 3 fighters and damaging several others on a single mission. He didn't get 12 kills in 4 minutes, a statistical impossibility that belongs in comic books, but he accomplished the tactical reality. He kept the tail clear. Then there was Staff Sgt Arthur Benko of the 305th Bomb Group. Benko was the antithesis of the spray and pray amateur. He was a former competition shooter who treated the .50 caliber like a sniper rifle. Benko realized that zone denial didn't always mean a wall of lead. Sometimes it meant a single psychological terror shot. He was known to destroy German fighters while they were still setting up their runs, hitting them at ranges that baffled his own officers. Benko tallied 16 confirmed kills, a staggering number for a defensive gunner before he was lost in a crash in 1943. These men proved that the fatal flaw, the defensive passivity of 1,942, could be overcome. But they also revealed the deeper truth about the statistics of war. The internet loves the story of 12 kills in 4 minutes. It's a dopamine hit. It sells the fantasy of the invincible super soldier. But the reality of the 8th Air Force was grittier and more profound. The goal wasn't to rack up a high score. It was to dismantle the Luftwaffe's cohesion. Every time an aggressive gunner like Arooth or Benko fired a burst at 1,000 yards, they weren't just wasting ammo. They were forcing a German pilot to make a choice. Press the attack and risk a head-on collision with a wall of tracers, or peel off and live to fly another day. When a German pilot broke formation, he became an individual. And an individual fighter plane is vulnerable. He loses his wingman's protection. He loses the coordinated firing solution. The Donovan doctrine of spraying the zone didn't just protect one bomber. It unraveled the tightly knit fabric of the German attack waves. It turned a disciplined pack of wolves into scattered, frightened dogs. The ghost in the machine wasn't just the Sperry sight, and it wasn't just the spirit of men like Arooth. It was the realization that suppression is a weapon. The 2,000 rounds fired by Hell's Fury didn't need to hit metal to be effective. They just needed to hit the mind. As the war ground toward 1,945, the B-17 seconds were no longer flying alone. The P-51 Mustangs, with their drop tanks and Merlin engines, were hunting the hunters. But in the dark, freezing tails of the bombers, the gunners remained the last line of defense. They had evolved from passive passengers into active combatants, armed with computing sights and a doctrine that prioritized volume over conservation. They had learned the hard lesson of the air war. You don't survive by hiding. You survive by making the enemy believe that you are the most dangerous thing in the sky. This evolution saved thousands of lives, but it came too late for some. The tragedy of the innovation loop is that it is written in blood. For every Arooth who figured it out, there were 100 unknown gunners who followed the old rules, waited for the effective range, and died with full ammunition belts. The story of the B-17 tail gunner isn't a superhero movie. It's a testament to the brutal adaptation of men under fire. They took a broken system, ignored the impossible odds, and engineered a way to fight back. But what happened to the men who survived? What happens when a street fighter from Boston or a sharpshooter from Arizona comes home from the edge of space? The war ends, but the ghost follows them down. The ghosts of the air war didn't haunt the skies over Europe. They settled into the quiet suburbs of post-war America. When the engines finally shut down in 1945, the men who manned the tail guns of the 8th Air Force returned to a world that couldn't comprehend the physics of their survival. They went back to factories, farms, and construction sites, leaving the aluminum carcasses of their B-17 seconds to be melted down into soda cans and siding. But the lesson they etched into the stratosphere remained. The B-17 Flying Fortress began the war as a victim of its own name, a fortress that doctrine claimed could fly unescorted, relying on tight formations and defensive fire. The Luftwaffe shattered that illusion in 1943. It was the gunners, the 19-year-old sergeants shivering in the slipstream, who rebuilt the doctrine from the inside out. They proved that the most dangerous weapon on a bomber wasn't the bomb load, it was the attitude of the defense. By shifting from passive conservation to aggressive denial, they transformed the B-17 from a target into a porcupine. They taught the Air Force that the cost of survival cannot be measured in pennies per round. When Mike Donovan or the real men like Michael Arooth and Arthur Benko held down those triggers, they weren't just firing bullets, they were buying time. They were trading cheap lead for the priceless seconds needed to drop their payload and turn for home. The Donovan Doctrine wasn't written in a manual. It was written in the empty ammunition boxes of the 390th Bomb Group. It was the refusal to accept the mathematical certainty of death. It was the understanding that in war, you do not wait for the enemy to act. You force him to react. You seize the initiative, even if your weapon is defensive, even if you are flying backward at 200 miles per hour. Yet, the gunners knew a secret that the propaganda films rarely mentioned. They could defend the bombers, they could make the Luftwaffe bleed, but they couldn't clear the skies. They were holding the line, waiting for a miracle to arrive from the west. They were waiting for a little friend that could go the distance, a fighter plane that didn't have to turn back at the German border. That miracle was sitting on a runway in England, fitted with a secret weapon that looked like garbage, a disposable paper fuel tank. The P-51 Mustang was about to change the rules again, and we will uncover the engineering scandal behind its paper range in our next briefing. If you believe that history is defined not by the generals who planned the wars, but by the soldiers who solved the impossible problems in the heat of combat, hit that like button and subscribe. Help us keep these stories from fading into the static. I'll see you in the next one.